Let's find out how we buy a house before we buy a house. Okay, so if you're a first-time home buyer, guess what? You don't really know a whole lot about the process of buying a house. Yeah, you know how to look at houses. Yeah, you kind of know what the prices are. Yeah, you can probably plug it into a mortgage calculator and figure out what am I going to owe, things like that. The very first thing that I would do if I was buying a house is to sit down with a lender and come up with a game plan for how much can I afford. That may not necessarily be how much do I make a year and figure it out that way, because if you're 1099, then you write stuff off for taxes, things like that. That's going to change the amount of money that you make a year. That's great for taxes if you can drop that number down, but that's not as good for buying a house because you've dropped that number down, and that's what lenders are going to usually look at. So it takes a while for lenders to kind of really figure that out. Now, if you're W-2, it's a little more straightforward, but it's important to know what your buying power is, okay? Because I don't want you looking at $900,000 houses if you really can only afford a $400,000 house. Everybody loves $900,000 houses. They're great. But I don't want you getting frustrated by looking at houses that you can't afford. And when you go to think about putting in an offer, it's like, oh yeah, that's right. That's like 3 times the amount of money we want to spend. I really want us to figure out what our buying power is, number one. Number two, the second thing I want you to do is I want you to sit down with a realtor. We have with our buyers something that we call the buyer strategy session. Okay, with the buyer strategy session, we go over how do you buy a house. We go over what in the state of Georgia is due diligence. We go over what we ask for when it comes to the due diligence period, the inspections that we do, what things we would recommend to do at the inspections, what we're going to ask for, what the financing contingency means. We talk about what it means to do the final walkthrough. We talk about all of it. We talk about the whole thing, because the reality is otherwise it's just you going looking at houses. And you go into a house like, that house was great. Now what do we do? You know what I mean? Like, you've got to figure out what the next steps are. That's why I think it's so important. Anytime that we sit down with our folks and actually have that strategy session before we get going, it's a lot smoother. The buyers are completely plugged into what we do next. The buyers are completely plugged into the entire process. They know when it's time to pull the trigger and make something happen. They know what to expect each of the next steps. Yeah, it's fun to look on Zillow. Yeah, it's fun to go out and look at houses. This is great, wonderful. But if we're going to be serious about buying your first house, those are the 2 things I'm doing first. Number 1, I'm talking to a lender to find out what my buying power is. Number 2, strategy session. Let's find out how we buy a house before we buy a house.